You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
But I am talking to Aaron Isleman, who I have known social media for years. He's a fellow libertarian, and we've ran in the same, social circles that way. But we've actually never spoken in person. So it's nice to hear your voice, Aaron.
Yeah, it's a trip to converse non-textually. Yeah.
Yes. So a little bit about yourself. I know that you're a libertarian. I don't know what kind you classify yourself as. I know that, and you don't have to have a flavor if you don't want to, but I know that you're a fan of objectivism, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, what was your path to liberty?
Right. Well, yeah, it's something, I've tried to trace it myself, like where exactly it came from, because there seem to be like so many different things that I can pull from in my memory. I think the first time I ever heard of libertarianism had to have been either Penn Jillette, something to do with Penn Teller, or it was actually Glenn Jacobs, the mayor of Knoxville, Mayor Kane, that probably reading Wikipedia and seeing that Kane was a libertarian. That might have been my first time hearing that word.
Your voice, it's tripping me out, Aaron. I'm not going to lie. Oh, by the way, my show's market explicit, so we can say bad words if we want, and you can say whatever the hell you want. But it just does not match you. So, you get this idea of somebody on the internet, and you're so well-spoken and really intelligent and well-read. And I consider yourself, like you, somebody that I would go to for like information from like a classical liberal, or just, a kind of a Renaissance guy. No offense to Southerners, but the Southern accent is not what I thought I would hear. That's
perfectly. Yeah, that's a very common assessment. Trust me. Yeah, it's insane actually, because like here in the South, I'm considered to have like little to no accent. Like they think I sound like a Yankee or whatever, but like everywhere else, they're like, wow, that's strong.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and I have like, when I started, doing lives and then eventually doing a podcast and whatever, people were like, oh, I had no idea. Are you from Minnesota? Are you from New York? I'm like, no, I have a Midwestern accent from Ohio, but apparently they think it's really like a Yankee accent. I don't know. I didn't think I had one. I thought people from the Midwest had pretty plain voices, but I guess not. So anyways, I interrupted you. It was just cracking me up.
Yeah, I could go on and on about it, but I think mainly I didn't really engage with like politics in a way that was serious until probably shortly before the 2016 election. I had always categorized politics as something I didn't even want to be involved in, but it eventually came a time where like learning about philosophy and science and other things intersects inevitably and inextricably with politics. So sooner or later you have to face down the demon. And I came into it as kind of a default leftist. I always had kind of I guess like hippie punk leanings that were just completely culturally defined, and I never really thought about the political concepts that went along with them. I went from it was a quick thing too when I started to go down the path of libertarian buzzwords and Googling different things and whatnot. It was a quick path from voting for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary to voting for Gary Johnson in the general election.
It's funny that you say that, because there's this huge, there's a lot of infighting, which there always has been, but it's pretty heated as of late in the Libertarian Party. And it's this left versus right thing. But I think it was even Larry Sharpe, who's pretty right and pretty conservative, I would say, in my opinion, says that a lot of times people from the left, people are like, it's easier to reach the right. But when people become libertarians from the left, they stay. They don't go back. And so he finds that with the party, at least, not necessarily just the philosophy. My husband came from the left. He voted for Obama, grew up. And it was more like that. He was a poet and really into he grew up as an atheist in his family, although he's not now. So he just assumed that he was supposed to be a leftist. And then he, started studying philosophy and realized that he was a libertarian. So do you believe in a small government, or do you believe in no government?
Oh, definitely. I think government is a legitimate concept. I think there ought to be a government. I don't view it. You see, this is an interesting thing. These days, I've got to the point where I would only classify myself as a libertarian in the most general sense of not being an authoritarian. Like, if we're talking about that spectrum, I'm definitely on the libertarian end of the spectrum. But
Oh,
every other thing that it seems to imply now, I don't exactly associate myself with. And a big part of that is this kind of a puritanism about anarchy. I've met a lot of thoughtful anarchists, a lot of philosophical anarchists, but I've met just as many very dogmatic anarchists, and they kind of hold the idea of the state being the great evil as their catch-all answer to the world in the same way I think as anybody with a catch-all explanation for the world employs that. And it's something
I
that,
agree. And I am an
yeah,
anarchist, and I quite agree.
well, I think that any perceptive anarchist would have to see that that's a very common problem for anarchism as a movement, as a argument. A lot of these people don't argue. They are purely rhetorical. They kind
Mhm.
of just generate things that they hold as axioms in their head. And it's a common thing to say. I know I'm not the first person to iterate this, but it is essentially just talking to someone as opposed to really having a conversation with them. It's essentially just like, why aren't you already smart enough to accept this philosophy? And
Right. And
yeah, I
you're not
diverge
really
with it.
planting seeds that way, which is something I've always believed in, even when sometimes I can be just plain old obtuse because I just get tired, but you have to plant seeds or actually really engage somebody. And I've changed my philosophy on a lot of things that I thought, oh, well, this is steadfast. This is the truth. And, that I'll never change from this because this is right. And then, listening to people, I realized that I was probably wrong. And there's a lot more nuance to things than just the state is evil. I don't believe in violent coercion. There's just a lot more to life than that.
Well, yes, I think that that's people kind of use this in the same way that, it's strange the blind spots people can have because they can perceive it clearly in, let's say, like leftist sort of Antifa strains of thought. They can see the cultishness of that, the dogmatic nature of that, but they can't identify any strain of that in their own behavior. When it's so clear to me that, like, one of the major paradoxes of this politically obsessed libertarian movement is that the groupthink that emerges is so lethal to the idea of individualism, which everyone in this conversation is paying a great deal of lip service to. So really, we're like, who actually has the follow through? Who really is an individualist? Who's actually thinking in a first-handed way? And it's disappointingly few people, proportionally.
Yeah, I've come to have a lot of respect for a lot of my agorists, or some people say agorist friends, because they just decided to just live what they believe and not really. Most of them don't spend their time spouting off at people online or they don't play political games. And so I think, in a way, I think that's one of the purest types of libertarian. Really, it's just somebody that just lives as far off the grid as they can and tries not to engage the state and live
Yes,
peacefully.
yes. There's
So
some real daylight between between that form of anarchism or that school of thought, really, because I think that that has elements that are kind of separate from even the concept of anarchism. There's a lot of like ethical consideration that goes into that kind of thought.
yeah,
Um,
but I like really pretty nice things, and I'm a capitalist.
no, look, no, I think
It's
that's all
just
part of
plain
life
truth.
too. These guys, I think that there's a healthy element of that where you are focused on self-improvement. And I really think at the end of the day, that's the thing that's shifted my thought so much to the point that I don't even really, I'm at a place, and it sounds utterly exasperated. It probably is, but I don't even really want to hear the word libertarian like ever again. People just say it and say it and say it, and it's this kind of thing and it's that kind of thing. And why don't you believe what I believe? And
You
it's
know,
all, to me,
Aaron, it's funny because I'm on the We Are Libertarians network, but really the creator who spent years in radio and has a large show and grew, it's a large network. He's put a lot of work into it over 10 years. Um, he stopped calling it We Are Libertarians, calls the big show the Chris Spangle Show, he's friend, and then changed it to Wall We Are Libertarians, which is a nickname, because he had the same sense that this word was just inviting people to think of the worst people that they knew, and he's more about reaching out to newbies, which is why I like the Stereo app, because it's all normies and people that have never heard of what we're talking about. Most people on here don't know what we're talking about, but they're actually like ask honest questions about it. So
right.
So that's okay. So I kind of understand your philosophy, but we're going to talk about something called objectivism. I really find fewer and fewer libertarian, maybe even conservative paleos or anarchists that really understand the philosophy. They all just want to burn Ayn Rand alive anymore. And it's such a shame to me, because you don't have to believe every single thing a person says to know that they had really awesome points and just a really great way of looking at things in life. So what would you call the philosophy of objectivism, if you could narrow it down into a paragraph or two?
Well, if you just, first of all, objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. So it's, it is what Rand thought and what Rand said approximately. Of course, there's all kinds of different evolving applications of the principles of objectivism as you're living life and as, science evolves and the field of knowledge increases. But it is what Rand wrote. So anything beyond that, what people, people try to have there are even people who consider themselves Christian objectivists, and they put all kinds of spins on it. I'm an anarcho-objectivist. Yes. You're not really. I know what people want to do. Everything these days is create an ideology. You just throw them together. But that's the thing that people find.
And not have to punch the clock, Aaron. I can't hate on
right.
it.
Well, I mean, it sure generates subreddits and various things like that. But no, objectivism comes down to 5 main things. It's metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. In metaphysics, existence, reality. Existence exists. Reality is what it is. It's, people can take this for read, but I think a lot of the dysfunction in people's personal philosophical thought and ethical conceptions of things comes from the fact that they really haven't identified and examined their first principles. I mean, if you haven't truly introspected over like reality itself, have you even really begun to build your foundation for who you are, your identity? That's something that I find fascinating about the entire question of it. Ayn Rand basically takes philosophical tradition since Aristotle and says, to hell with like 98% of that. We're going back to what is knowledge? Where are we? What even is our interface with reality? And that gets to epistemology. How do we know? And there Rand says reason. Reason is the only means of knowledge available to us. You contrast that with mysticism, the non-rational, the non-sensory claim on the means of logic. And those two, the metaphysics and epistemology, give you the ethics of selfishness. And this is the part that really changed my life. And it's the part that gets everyone suspicious about Rand. It's the part where the cultish image that's been applied over the years gets labeled at objectivism, because this is the part that really messes with people's conception of things. And it leaves a mark on them, either a strongly positive or negative one.
Well, what's ironic is there's in Christianity, there's obviously a million different little philosophies in there, but I don't know if you know anything about Calvinism, but I consider it very much saying that, virtue, that people are born a certain way and they can't control the fact that they are. There's no spiritual thing that's going to make them better besides Christ. So they're giving this basis that people automatically will be selfish, and that's the human condition. And it's kind of true in a way. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's labeled as a sin, but it's still, I've always thought of that, especially growing up in a very Christian household. And then when I started to turn my philosophy and faith, trying to see threads of truth through all of that.
Right. No, I find that very interesting, though. And this is something I've always wanted to have a conversation with someone that, there are a lot of people that heavily appreciate the ideas of Ayn Rand and the sort of concepts that are in objectivism, but they mix it with their own kind of background and their own sort of primary ideas about things, and a lot of that for people is religious. And it's always, to me, it's incredibly interesting, just because objectivism is so flatly opposed to the mystical, to anything in the non-rational world, which, you know, religion broadly falls into that category when we're talking about things that don't interact with the world, such as culture or whatever.
Right.
And that's where, you know, you get social structures, and how is society structured, and what do we do in lieu of religion if we don't have religion? How do we, you know, have a positive frame of morality without religion? And these are all questions that I think, like, it has to be somewhat of like a conflict, or is it? Like, I wonder, like, how do people integrate these ideas? Take, for example, like altruism, the idea that Ayn Rand is most heavily opposed to, the idea of self-sacrifice.
Yeah, she thinks you're a pitiful little man if you if you sacrifice yourself and it doesn't benefit you, basically.
Right. Well, think of the central image of Christianity, Christ on the cross. That is essentially an epitomization of altruism as Ayn Rand sees it. And
yes, except for, I would say, even if you don't necessarily believe that Christ was the Son of God, or he was just a philosopher, or maybe you don't even believe he actually walked the earth, his story does. And so in that story, even Christ was exalted to heaven, whether he actually was or wasn't, or what, it doesn't. So in the end, he did something that got him somewhere. So even Christ served himself, which he thought he was God, and people believe he was. So isn't that right? Really not altruism?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good try that you've just pulled off there. No, I think that you'd have to go deeper into the fundamentals of it, because the framing, of course, of this, I mean, there are lots of fundamental questions about religion that are touched by the sheer dismissal of religion that's contained within objectivism. For Rand, it's very flat. Reality is what it is, and it's very apparent that there's no supernatural dimension to it, and that just dismisses all religion. A lot of people have a very, very hard time with that.
Right, and I wouldn't say I necessarily agree with that, but I think it's a really good way for me to strip down some things that I really believe this? Do I know what is truth? And a good way to look at the world and people's intentions. It's a great way to understand how people work.
Right, and there's a heavy psychological element to morality and ethics as it's practiced. So I think that's a heavy part that we get to here, and it kind of touches on what we were talking about earlier, because, like, as I'm going down, like, this list of things that are contained within this philosophy, you're seeing that it touches pretty much every element of life. It's not really about what you think, it's about a system or mode of thinking. And that is what I feel is missing from the conversation these days. People really want to talk politics. They really want to have a position on every little issue and be morally convicted about it with the full power of righteous justice. But they don't want to do the fundamental groundwork to even figure out what it is they believe.
Yeah, you make poor arguments that way. Well, what if this happened? How do you think of this? Or should we say no to this? Or should we ban this? But what if, my kid walked onto your property and drowned in your lake? You'd be violating that. It's like, what the fuck are we even talking about at this point? Let's just get down to the basics,
Right. And so much of it is purely hypothetical, purely theoretical. It's all, Rand had a great essay called The Ethics of Emergency, which was all about, the sort of philosophical brain teasers, or, kind of gotcha questions that people throw out there, your little trolley dilemmas and such. And she, in a controversial move, just throws that all aside and goes, listen, that's not real life. We're talking about a philosophy for being a human being, for living on Earth, for interacting with reality. We can't deal in crazy hypotheticals that might happen, but would have to be considered drastic emergencies and anomalies, and totally outside the realm of normal ethics. So the conversation has to get serious. We can't sit here and talk. I mean, I know we love our memes. I know we love our recreational nukes. I know we love our child slaves and, sponsored police forces. Right. It's all lovely and it's all hilarious, and I'm glad we're having fun. But there has to be a serious conversation somewhere underneath all that. And a lot of these folks don't know where to draw the line. And it's pretty clear to me that it comes from a hole in the fundamental nature of the conversation. People are not doing the basic is, ought, fact, reality, ethics, morals work. They're doing the pontificating, the skipping to the end where you get to brag and boast and enforce.
Yeah, that's hard work. And I also don't think it's encouraged much anymore. You know, we have instant gratification a lot. So there's not a lot of time spent studying anymore, or just with your own thoughts. You know, you're constantly bombarded by other people, like, and not deep thinkers. You're bombarded by, which, God, I love them, memes. Which, real quick, Aaron, for anybody looking, and I think this page is still up. I think it's David Gates, one of his pages, one of the Liberty Memes brothers, but it's called Tales from Strawman Kapistan, and it is it's like what people say the worst thing that anarcho-capitalists would do in a free society like that, and it's hysterical because it pokes fun at they are anarcho-capitalists, but it's like talking about recreational McNewts and when the neighbor's kid accidentally fell on your lawn and you shot his leg off.
Right.
So anyway,
these are the questions. Yeah, I think that's part of the whole conversation now is very limited to surface level concretes, things that people can just perceive right in front of them. It has to be very immediate. It has to be almost always sensational. Something that's designed to grab people's attention and manipulate their capacity to reason. People are being fed things that are there just to piss them off. Everyone wants to talk about the algorithm and how threatening it is. But at the end of the day, we're all in control of this experience. You don't have to feed it. You don't have to be there. There's nothing, and the algorithms are terribly, terribly bad at predicting people's behavior. They don't, if you notice what they advertise to you, it's not always the most accurate or relevant thing on earth. I've seen more than a few meme pages devoted to the oddities that people have had advertised to them. Yeah. I think we all know it, that this thing is not really as threatening as it's being made out to be in our beloved Netflix documentaries and whatnot. This is all a reversal of what our reality really is. And I think that it's done largely on purpose by people who influence society, because they're very aware that a lot of our culture is built on contradictions, and the way to keep people away from their own capacities, the way to keep the unearned wealth that so many have in this current system, is to keep freedom, true freedom, the ideal of liberty, completely untalked about, just out of the conversation. It's eliminated because people cannot think in concepts. They only think in objects. They're only dealing with immediate reality. They're not dealing with the idea. Right. And that's why we get a culture obsessed with politics that doesn't really talk about philosophy or what's behind any of those ideas.
Well, and sometimes we'll sit and focus on the smallest thing. And, like on the big show on the network, it's a lot of politics and like latest news, and it's good to keep up on that kind of stuff. But sometimes I'll sit back. Do you ever just get that moment where you're in a room with people, and probably people that are kind of stuck in the left-right dichotomy or whatever, and I'm like, why are we even talking about this? Because across the globe, like there's a million children starving to death, and we're talking about some little part of some bill that was passed and how it just doesn't make much damn sense to me sometimes. But
it's a distortion.
I lean on philosophy more so than current events, but to sometimes to my dismay. But it's easier to just live in the now.
Well, yeah, the primary thing is to deal with that which actually benefits your life, what's actually of consequence to you and your values. Like there is no real thing, if you're being completely honest, as term self-interest. Everything at the end of the day is about how you live, your mode of living. And this, I don't see how it's not manifestly obvious to anyone that this kind of obsessed, paranoid, hyper reactive, super sensitive, very touchy online political culture is healthy. How could it possibly be?
Right.
I mean, we're practically collecting and archiving and curating collections of the pain that this is causing each other, and rolling our eyes and laughing because it's all we know how to do. When at the end of the day,
well, that's the comedy is the remedy to tragedy.
right? There's a great deal of that that's needed, but we do have to have the serious conversation, and a lot of this is lost.
How it's stunting young minds that don't have their frontal cortex completely developed.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's what's horrifying to me.
I grew up in an age without social media. We had AOL chat rooms and that kind of stuff, but it was nothing that I really, I read books. I hung out with people, behind the movie theater. We'd smoke some cigarettes and just have that kind of life, that whole, and kids don't really do that anymore. Their whole world is that world. So I feel like we're developing a really scary generation of people. And I don't know how they're going to act once they become, the people that are, contributing more to society than us.
Well, I think this is a great example of history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I think that there's something almost poetic about how scared people are now, and rightly so, of the current developments, and yet how mundane they are in the long term. If you really look at it, this is just the ultimate outcome of everything. Everything that's led up to now has almost been pathetically predictable, and yet none of us really saw it coming. None of us really saw this crazy society where children are just, they have iPhones just shoved into their hands almost immediately. It seems like, and this sort of conversation, even is kind of tainted by a kind of shadow of boomerism, like any sort of concern about technology or like hyper-oriented fixation on all this stuff is just dismissible because, of course, it's just technology and it's just evolution. And that is true to a degree, but what people are missing is, let's just draw attention to something like Carl Sagan calling out in The Demon Haunted World, which I believe was published in the late 80s, kind of called out the fact that science and technology had gotten to a point, even then, where they were moving so far beyond the public comprehension of them as subjects and as practices that it was actively dangerous. And that was decades ago. Mm-hmm. I think that this is just a continuation and an obvious outcome of that problem going unaddressed.
There's no stopping it. You can't stop it. It's a machine almost.
No, there is no stopping the process. It just, you have to do, this kind of comes down to ultimate fundamental worldview questions that go even beyond what is like the tone and tenor of your philosophy. It comes down to fundamental things like, are you a fatalist? Are you a nihilist? Because a lot of people, in the face of everything we're seeing in the world right now, are becoming casually nihilistic and just falling into a kind of pit. Values are draining into the gravity of non-being and void faster than anything. It's utterly horrifying if you look around. And yet all this is a response to a world that, as a matter of verifiable fact, is the safest, most privileged time you could possibly live in.
Yes, it's quite ironic because a lot of people, I did talk about the next generation, coming up, and that frightens me in that regard. But we have so many helicopter parents, and it's funny. The book that actually started, because I read Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead a long time ago because I was conservative, and of course I saw it for what I wanted to see it for, not for what those novels were.
Right.
So it wasn't until I became more libertarian that I started reading more of philosophy. I was like, oh, okay. But so going back to what children being in the safest time, I read Free Range Kids by Lenore Skenazy. It was just, and I didn't know at the time she's actually a libertarian, but that's not what the book was about at all. It was about statistics and how we're hovering over our children and we're actually like crippling them because we're not letting them experience things. And it's actually the safest time in the world. A child would have to stand on a street corner and get struck by lightning like 10 times in a row, I think. That's just as likely as, them being kidnapped by a stranger twice or things like that, like stranger kidnappings. She would just go through crime stats and like allowing your kid to sit in the car when you go in the store is actually not a horrible thing to do. And we framed it, so we're all pointing fingers at other parents and, nobody's letting their kids experience life. So that actually started me down a very different path, which was a weird way to come to libertarianism. But so that is something that we could change. But instead of that, we've shoved devices in kids' hands.
Well, it's always going to be a system. I mean, right. So Lenore Skenazy, I know that name as having, she came to a certain level of prominence because of a story that was written about her done about her because of her son.
Yeah,
and
that
I
was
remember
the beginning of the
that,
book.
My introduction to her was a Penn and Teller show bullshit. She was on there talking about helicopter
We
parenting.
have those DVDs at home from my husband.
Right. Yes. And this is the thing, right? This is a great example of what in objectivism, a big word that gets tossed around a lot is integration. And that's just because it's a fundamental thing to do, to integrate knowledge where you can. If you figure out something in one area of life, you don't need to reconstruct it all over again when you face another similar problem in another area of life. And this is a great example of that. We like to atomize issues. We like to microscope in on things and wonder, where is all this helicopter parenting coming from? What is the nature of this? What are the characteristics? How do we define it? What do we do about it? If you zoom out, this is all just utterly symptomatic of the deeper problems that have always been here. And it has to be, clearly, right? Because this is a case of parents transferring their issues down to their kids. And this is generational. It didn't start nowhere. Everyone loves to talk about these mythical generations of badasses that just didn't have any feelings and they were super invulnerable and back in my day, and it never happened. All this came from somewhere. There was always a void. There was always a fragility. There was always a super sensitivity waiting to be unlocked. And there's a story to it. And until we address that story, what happened through the generations? Why did we get the self-esteem movement that didn't give anyone self-esteem? Well,
ironically, when you talk about, there's a lot of I would consider them brutalists that are, they want to go harken back to this time when people weren't so, precious and breakable and this and that. But I think I don't want to go back there. Maybe you do, but I'm a woman. I don't want to live back then. So I think they blame on, losing God in schools and these ridiculous concepts. But that's not what you're saying is interesting, because you're saying it's always been there. I don't think it needed to be unlocked. I think it probably just had a different outlet.
Well, they are different expressions of the same problem. That's why it would be beyond pointless to ask the question, would you prefer a society of super sensitive, hyper tragic people who just can't withstand any sort of criticism, or would you rather have a society full of people who are emotionally repressed, who are violent due to their lack of self-concept, who completely interface with reality in a way that makes them volatile and untrustworthy and not a good authority on anything, not an especially good loved one or a member of society? I mean, I think we all know that the real secret of back in my day is that it never really happened. It was always just another different expression of the unhealthiness of what was lacking in society, what was lacking in culture. It's a different form of neglect, an emotional neglect that sees someone become rigid and unresponsive, and they consider themselves hardened, and as if this were battle scars and whatnot. And for some people who have adapted in a healthy way to what happened to them, I'm sure it is. In fact, I know it is. I have many personal experiences with people who've made it out of horrible situations and adjusted to the things that they've been through. But when people don't adjust, the solemn serial killer, like, my mom beat me and look how I turned out. That's not, nobody lets you watch their kids for a reason, homeboy. That's,
well, everybody who always makes that argument, and I understand it's really just ingrained in our culture, although it's going away generationally. But the spanking thing, which number one, there's no scientific evidence that shows that it does any good. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But people say, well, I was hit with a belt and I turned out okay. And I always think that I'm like, well, I think you're a little broken, but okay. And I was belted as well, so.
Yeah, and these are subjects, right? It's the gravity is almost toward disbelief and a sort of comic absurdity, because for those of us who understand or have thought through the ethics of it, it does seem absurd. But at the end of the day, we're really talking about child abuse, and there does have to be a sort of conversational intolerance around this subject. If we're going to own up to the idea that there's any such thing as responsibility or morality at all, it has to apply to a realm like this. And it is this simple. That you don't have to, I mean, this is one of these examples, right, where there's no need to rationalize, there's no need to intellectualize, there's no need to get super complicated about it. You can just investigate reality for yourself and see first-handedly what is the obvious psychological nature of the idea of beating a kid. This is force. That's all it is. And what is force except an entity, a concept, a thing that in practice and in effect and in application stops reasoning entirely. Mm-hmm. It is impossible for a child, as it is impossible for anyone at any point, to reason while they're being threatened with force.
Right. In fact, you'll get the opposite of reason from them, just like torture, that people don't give you good information or learn things when they're being hit.
Right. Yes. Pavlovian conditioning is not ethical education. It's not. It's
desiring an outcome from somebody and not for them to learn something. You want to teach children to become adults, not to become you.
Yes. Yeah. Practicing a martial art or a sport or exercising regularly, that's discipline. Doing things with consistency and dedication and timeliness, that's discipline.
Meditating for an hour, that's hard for me.
Yes, doing the hard things, challenging yourself, reasoning your way to a new plane, to a new level. That is the essence. And yet, what is the idea behind this abuse module? And they don't want to call it that. They want to call it by euphemisms. And this is something that I think people who are reasonable and rational and have a moral bone in their body have to be utterly intolerant of. We have to take a George Carlin line here on euphemisms and say none. We're not calling it discipline. We're calling it child abuse. We're calling it hitting kids, because that's what it is. You're hitting
you ever see that easy flow chart? Says, can your child understand reason? Then don't hit your child, asshole. Can your child understand reason? Yes. Then reason with him and don't hit him.
And this goes to another thing, right? So examine the common catchphrases. Well, I learned my lesson. No, you didn't. You didn't learn anything, because no one can learn anything while they're being threatened with force.
You learn to be afraid of something and either find a way around it or not understand why you shouldn't do it, just the fact that you were going to be hit.
All
you
you
understand a consequence. You only understood the consequence was being hit.
Right. All you've essentially done is conditioned, in a sense, sort of like muscle memory. It's a thing that's not even up to you in a sense. This is past your volition. This is you foregoing your volition because you can't use it in this moment. You're accepting the reality and trying to find a way to cope with it. It's not psychologically healthy. And this is a great example of a subject where there is a massive conversational denial around this idea, and there is a false perception of like a golden mean, that there must be the answer, the truly logical, correct view of the subject must be some mythical middle ground between super sensitive, nerf the world, helicopter parenting, no challenges, no discipline whatsoever, and outright beating your child.
Right.
And at the end of the day, these sort of mythical middle grounds are not really a thing. They're often conceived of false dichotomies, and this is a great example. There is no reason why the choices should be violence or pacifism.
Right.
Or in other words, inaction and force. There's no reason why that should be the dichotomy. Reason itself gives way to a concept of ethics that can let you move through these things. Just apply basic ideas and you get there. You don't need to rationalize this. You don't need to look at scientific studies about what happened. Smack a kid and see how they react. There's your study. Okay.
Boy, who got to join that study?
Quote me on that one. There's a great out of context one for you.
Aaron, you brought up one of my favorite comedians of all time, George Carlin. I think probably a lot of people on the liberty side probably agree. Well, not everybody. So do you think he was an objectivist? And if maybe he was, and I just don't know enough about his, life and history, he really presents as one to me.
Well, in a lot of ways, but in some ways, it depends largely on how much of his comedy you think was reflective of his legitimate philosophy on life. Because he did a lot of interviews where it seems like a lot of the more fatalistic stuff that he would say in his routine was something that he actually believed. I mean, he was very big on the concept of not giving a shit, which is very, very opposed to the Randian concept of what man is. But on the other hand, if you examine the man in practice, if you examine what he did in his life, he lived life in a very, not exactly a Randian way, but in a way that would in large ways fall into a category of a Rand-like hero, a guy who could not be told no, a guy who just relentlessly pursued his vision. And while he talked a great deal about it, this is the thing that's so confusing about Carlin. I don't know how much of him to take at face value because he talked a great deal.
And with a comedian too, that's hard because obviously you're going to use hyperbole and sarcasm and to make people laugh. You're trying to elicit laughter from people, to connect with them. So you don't really know how much of that they believe, but in the end, I guess it is the fact that there has to be some truth to what they're saying. I mean, comedians are really the only truth tellers left in society. Right.
Yeah, no, Carlin, though, if you look at the content of his comedy and the sort of positions that you can deduce from what he actually thinks, so there are people like Bill Hicks that if you listen to anything that they do, it's easy to see where they stand. Carlin does revel in ambiguity a little bit more. But he also throws some things out there that are very obvious. You can tell how he feels about religion, but you can also tell how he feels in a way about class society. And he has some views about that are kind of divergent with the idea of individualistic capitalism. I don't know to what degree it's conscious, but he definitely does have your sort of standard big business is bad sort of view of things.
There's something to that though, because a lot of older anarchists, and I can't remember her name. Oh gosh, was it Goulding? Spoke about capitalism negatively, but what she meant was that capitalism was government or forms of societies that people ordered themselves in to oppress a different class or whatever. So she wasn't really talking about liberty or voluntarism or anarchism. So it's an interesting concept, and I think there's truth to it. Gasp. I think that in a voluntary society, we still have a bunch of assholes and big problems.
No, that's a big thing that I think people get hung up on, and they don't need to. It's a great formulation of it that I don't know if it's native to Amy Peikoff, but I'm gonna say it's her quote. That the only practical thing is to be an idealist. And that's utterly true. But there's a way to apply that isn't skipping to the end. You don't sit there and obsess yourself with every detail of an ideal society when you know for a fact that where you're standing is a million miles away from that. That abstract idea, that ideal image that you need to have. Don't get me wrong. It's necessary. It's a thing that you, in a way, have to have in you somewhere, is the idea of what the ideal is, the ultimate ideal. And this is in so many areas of life. What your ideal about everything. What do you think is ideal as far as like what you do in life, what you produce, what you put into the world? What's your ideal relationship? What's your ideal, journey through this world?
It's funny because a lot of people think about Ayn Rand and her philosophy and think that they consider her a negative person or somehow a bad person. And it's quite the opposite, isn't it?
Oh my God. It's, I mean, I can't tell you, I think that part of the big appeal here is that it is really talking, I'm no longer in the realm of political noise all day. I engage with philosophy itself, with the idea of concepts and ideas, and objectivism touches capitalism as a derivative. It's politics is just the consequence of applying selfishness, moral self-interest. Capitalism is just the expression of that politically. But one of the things that people don't talk about too much that I think is probably the most fascinating thing in objectivism is Rand's view of art, of aesthetics. She's a romantic. I mean, for a person that people try to cast in such gray, drab tones, this is a woman whose heart is on fire for the passion of life and of being. The perception of her as negative comes, I think, and this is just my humble assessment here. Well, it's got partly to do with that whole development, but I think that a lot of it is because she is ruthlessly critical of society as it is. But her study of art reveals what's really at the core of her thought, which is idealism. She described art as, and I've never heard, just let me make this note real quick. Ask anybody you know, what is art? They're almost guaranteed to answer you with some kind of bullshit, because that's a really difficult question, and most of us have never actually sat there and tried to define it for ourselves before. But Ayn Rand put forward a definition of art that's the first one that didn't leave me confused or feeling like it was contradictory, and had me sitting there like, wow, that might be it. And that was, art is a selective recreation of reality according to the values of the artist. And that right there changed my life. I've been an artist for a very long time. I've been involved in music for a very long time. I've been a writer for a very long time. And I didn't, until that moment, truly understand what art even was. And now I'm looking at things in a different way and discovering exactly why it was so easy to perceive Rand as angry and negative. Because if you look around and you're looking for value-oriented art and things that are not gray and drab and nihilistic and rooted in a kind of dreary realism, then you're probably out of luck for the most part.
Yeah, no, that's quite true. It's very cheap anymore. I wouldn't call it art.
Right. No, and that is, people view this as like a sort of militaristic thing, right? Like, how are you going to define what is and isn't art? Isn't this just you being the guy that says, I don't like Nickelback, therefore it's not music? Isn't this just you being Ben Shapiro and going, I don't understand rap, therefore it's not music? Well,
it's funny you bring that up. I grew up in that was my major in college. My parents are opera singers, and so I was classically trained and raised that way. And then my dad went into church music. My parents were hippies that got saved and completely changed their lives. But anyway, I always thought that, music, as an art form speaks to you so much more than the written word, because especially if you take something with lyrics, it's like how do you remember things? I remember them in a song. If I hear a song a couple times, I know, I can recite the entire song to you. I really can't recite back a lot of the books I've read. I mean, maybe certain passages and things. So I think that art expressed really, it kind of like burns the image of what that person that made it onto the other person's soul. It really, it's stuck in you, it's with you forever. And I don't think that Ariana Grande is going to stick in my soul and be with me forever.
Right. No, I'm in the Romantic Manifesto, which is the book that collected essays concerning Rand's ideas about romanticism and fiction and art. There's a great essay called Art and Cognition where she points out the difference between music and other art forms that makes it so interesting. And this is another thing that for a person that's painted...
I have not read that essay.
Oh my God. These are some of my favorites. Like,
well, I'm sure we have it here in the library, so that's going to be my next thing.
Oh, right on. Yeah, no, I would recommend it to anybody. It was probably the second or third Rand book that I actually got into, even before the fiction. Like, I was so fascinated. Yeah, and she talks about how music is so unique because it reverses the normal process that you have when you interact with art. Other arts, you have an object. You have a process of perceiving that object, conceptually grasping it, and then appraising it to yourself. Whereas in music, you go the opposite direction. You perceive it, you feel it, and then you appraise it. And after that, far after all that, is when you put it together as a concept in your head. You can experience a song and be completely lost in it, and only it may be moments later, it may be decades later, that you finally understand what it actually meant to you, what those words were saying to you, why that arrangement of chords really spoke to you in a certain way. And the line that sticks in my head here, I have it pulled up here to make sure that I've worded it correctly. Music is experienced as if it had the power to reach man's emotions directly. That is such a concise, purely, it's the kind of thing people call intuitive, but it's so, in a way, relieving to hear someone formulate it so directly. Yes, that is exactly what it is. And this, this
something I love about Rand that you keep bringing up, and it's true, she was a really good interpreter of things for the rest of the human race. I have this huge poster of just a ton of her quotes, some really popular ones. And it's just like, God, that's so brilliant. Why didn't I think to say it like that? with a lot of what she says, she interpreted life very succinctly, and she didn't, she wasn't super verbose or anything like that. Obviously she wrote
right,
a lot, but she could, the common person could understand what she was trying to convey.
Right.
She's a great interpreter of life and philosophy. I don't think we have a lot of those anymore.
Oh no, I think it. It's very standard in a way. It's utterly predictable for the objectivist to come on and tell you how much of a great writer that Rand was, but it seems relevant because a big slander on her that's always pushed off is the idea that she actually wasn't. That these are massively overrated books. Everyone's just crazy. What's the appeal? I mean, she couldn't write for anything, and there was a meme.
That's the edgelords that say that because it's come on. We all
it's fascinating to me because compare any passage, and I mean any passage of Rand's, fiction, nonfiction, whatever, to these other philosophers that people venerate. Bust open a page of Immanuel Kant real quick and try to say all that out loud. This guy is as intentionally dense as you could possibly. If he were around today, people would identify him as the sort of, nose in the air hipster type. Like, this is a guy trying to muddy the waters so that they seem deep. Whereas Rand wants to clear the water completely and let you see right to the bottom. That's
her words will live on a lot longer. Not that Kant's haven't, but not in most circles. Most people,
right. Well, his ideas are currently,
not know.
Yeah. His epistemology is currently far more dominant. So, He's
But
got it for now, but I also have that romantic idea that good ideas win in the end, and
yeah,
this
well,
isn't
I mean, you
forever.
think about the philosophy of Christ, and this is, again, I say this for all people, even people that are atheists. There's a reason why his story still echoes. There's a reason, because he really reduced things down for common people, and he said things that other people were afraid to say, and he said them in a really good way. He said them in stories, and so that's why that philosophy endures. Now, people have perverted it nonstop because that's what people do. But if you look back through history, people that can speak to the masses and get them to understand philosophy and ideologies and stuff like that, those are the people whose voices echo, and those are the people that live forever.
Right. No, I think that there is an element of we do want these kind of oracle people, and they come along so seldom that they're almost bound to have some lasting impression if their word ever reaches anyone. It spreads like wildfire. And these people, clearly, like, I have a ton of objections and analyses and criticisms of the ideals of various religions. And, Christianity, is not accepted under any means. That's probably where I started. But it is a given that these ideas, I mean, you can take the sort of Jordan Peterson route on it, right? Like, you don't really have to talk about the metaphysical truth of these claims. The stories endure because I think that they address things that people needed to talk about. And while I think, and this is something I'd be really interested to go into as much as possible. I don't know what the time constraint is here or whatever.
Well, you know what? I usually do like an hour and something show, but I'm going to do a second one with you, and I'll put you on a second series because I'm home right now. I'm off work. So as long as we can squeeze it into your schedule, then we're going to do a second one. So that because usually an hour, people will listen to that. So we'll do a continuation of this. So I'm going to ask you this last question. And then after we get off here, I'll chit chat and find out when we can do it soon so I can put them both up together. Who do you think today, right now, is an Ayn Rand? Who is a good oracle right now? A living person.
Am
I going to be really depressed?
Well, you have to think about it on what level, right? What is exactly the context? Because we can look at it in different ways. If you talk about intellectuals, if you talk about people who are actually out there giving what I think is the right idea. I would say intellectuals, I guess, was what I was looking for. You're right. I didn't make that clear because there's always plenty of, I think Joe Rogan's a great person that people listen to. I don't think he's an intellectual, but people like him. That's questions. He asks. He's an interesting sort of category. He's he's an everyman sort of intellectual. I think the Joe Rogan, I think I once heard him describe himself as a smart dumb guy, and I think that's a great description. And I think it's a category of people that we need more of. Because most people are not going to be like obsessed with being intellectuals and everything like that, and that's perfectly fine. Everybody's going to have different values in life. What we need are people who, even if they're totally into just normal stuff and they don't care about super elevated ideas, people who have fundamental ideas about reality that don't cause them to be harmful to the rest of us. But and on that note, intellectuals who are out there mainly these days, Yaron Brook would be a big one in objectivism. In his show, the Yaron Brook show, he mainly talks about politics and economics. That's really more his specialty, but from a perspective of objectivist philosophy. And if you really talk about philosophy itself, Don Watkins is a name that's out there now, and he's kind of making more and more YouTube content that's got more production value to it, and
I'm unfamiliar with him.
Right. He's a great writer, and he's a really good communicator of objectivist ideas. He's doing series of works where he's examining not just Rand, but people contrary to Rand, like Kant, and going through their work and trying to summarize the ideas. It's the very thorough work that I, have just several times complained about people not doing. This is an example of a guy really pursuing, what is the nature of these ideas? There's not just a terrible lot of people out there, but they're usually collected around a couple of channels you can find, the Ayn Rand Institute on YouTube or the Ayn Rand Center UK. I think they have.
Be careful if you Google Ayn Rand, people, because some places will use her name and they have absolutely nothing to do with her when you read their content.
And a lot of the things you're immediately going to get are going to be slanders and various articles over the years trying to, denigrate her reputation and things like that. I'm not a person. I'm fairly new to this thing of objectivism, right? I've only been in it a couple of years. I'm not. One relieving thing about it is that I'm not in the label game of hyper obsessed political libertarian movement anymore, and I don't particularly care if someone thinks I'm a real objectivist or what it is, and I don't find that other objectivists that I talk to, they're not concerned with that kind of a thing. They don't.
So you're not the author of the only real objectivist channel.
Right. Yes, I'm just learning. You see, there's a kind of terminology that some people use in objectivism where they refer to themselves as a student of the philosophy rather than just I am an objectivist. It's kind of the consideration of like, in my crazy mythical brain, it sounds like a Jedi Padawan system. It's like there are certain few people who've been around long enough and studied these ideas long enough that we can say that they're authorities on this philosophy. The rest of us are students. We're all just learning. And I don't view this as some dogma. The minute I think that Ayn Rand's wrong, I'll be the first to tell everyone. Right now, as I sit here, I think she was fucking right about nearly everything. and
I actually, not just for the facts of what she wrote in her philosophy and how she translated it, her as a person I find very interesting. I know everything about her life, so you can't shock me if you think that I've got some weird conservative, panties that'll get in a bunch or something. But the fact of where she came from and the fact that she was a woman, and it was just so very strange for her to consider herself less than a man. Like, I don't think that was really on her radar. And so to just go forth so boldly with this philosophy that people were like, oh, what? And like, it was a very conservative society. It was a very religious, Christian-based society. She just had such big balls for a woman.
Oh, yeah, no, she's very inspiring as a person herself. And that it's a double-edged sword because people get obsessed with the person. And in doing so, they completely.
She was also really fucking weird, and that's fine.
Yeah. And people use that to try and, disregard and discredit the ideas that she had. And a lot of that argument takes the form of, well, she didn't live her ideas. That is complete nonsense. This is a woman who saw totalitarianism in her earliest formative years and knew what it meant to reject it, to flee it, to actively rebel against it. This is a woman who had nothing, who learned another language and learned to write, in my opinion, masterfully in it, to speak masterfully in it in her wildly distinctive accent, and to be this charismatic person who just went around as much as she could, making her way in the world, until she dropped. And she kept working and kept doing it until she dropped. I don't know how that's not an Ayn Rand hero. She was her own hero, and that's an inspiring example to me.
And, anybody who says, well, she didn't live her principles, my reply is always, if you drove on the road today, shut your mouth and go away. Because I just don't I have time for that. I don't argue about that dumb stuff anymore.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So we're going to wrap this episode up, but I want to get with you and go back into a little bit deeper into objectivism. And I'm going to ask you a few Randian questions of people that argue in the objectivist camp about. But right now, while we're ending this episode, because I'm probably going to toss this up on the podcast because it was so much fun. What are you doing, Aaron? Do you like a social media following? What projects are you working on that people can check out?
Yeah, look, I'm mainly just a musician. That's kind of just what I do. And I'm not super self-promoting about it, but if you do want to follow me on Twitter and get odd objectivist opinions and musical opinions and commentary about wild pro wrestling and lots of bullshit and whatever, then I'm on Twitter at Aaron you bitch you. And I have youtube.com/Rabid Records TV, 2Bs, RECK, because I'm an edgy teenager at heart. Rabid Records TV, and that's where I put all my music, even the old embarrassing demos. It's all there.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
And
I've been thinking about people have been telling me people have been telling me to do podcasts and things like that forever. It may be that, I start talking about philosophy and politics and things more through those channels, but who knows? I kind of like to keep it to the art, but we'll see.
All right, then everybody go follow Aaron. Click on everything, subscribe, because it always helps to get subscribers, because eventually he can monetize things. I don't know if you do now or not. And that helps, especially if you want to help an artist out. Until next time, because we'll have another episode on this, I just want to say peace, grace, and love to you all, and fuck the state.
That's a good way to end.
All right, Aaron, I'll catch you over on the flip side.
Word to the street. Peace.